for a start.
Yeah, there's
You
two
want it,
Rabbi.
Lauren, yes.
That's true, yes.
Rabbi, I suggest you take vitamin D. That will keep the stuff away from you.
Okay.
Isn't that vitamin C?
Seriously, vitamin D.
But D's good as well. D's good as well for immunity, apparently.
Yeah, it's good. So that will help him.
Help.
I was on a Zoom meeting with relatives in America yesterday, and one of them is he's a professor in Chicago, and he's a medical man, oncologist, and he's always giving talks. And he said that for COVID, lots of vitamin D is your best
Yeah,
defense.
I've been taking vitamin D.
I have as well.
Yeah.
Me too, for years.
Yeah, it's good to take it anyway. My doctor said everybody should take vitamin
Well,
D.
because we don't get enough sun in this country,
Yeah.
especially in the
Yeah.
winter, and especially if you're stuck indoors with as we have been a lot this year.
Yeah.
Right.
Everything got food.
I think we're good to go. Let's see if we can share the screen without internet. 1 second. Share the screen. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I didn't. Funny enough, my feet were cold, but I'm waiting for my feet to get hot. I thought, come on.
Right. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so possibly going to end slightly earlier today. We'll see how we do. So good morning, everyone. This week,
Morning.
Morning.
Mikketz. It's interesting. The first piece of laning I did after my bar mitzvah. So my bar mitzvah teachers sort of, I would say, made me, but used to have a laning rota in Carmel. So it was the fifth aliyah of Mikketz, which is very long, but it was good. It was good. What do you call it? Practice, conditioning, whatever you want to call it. I always remember it ever since. Okay, so Iris, over to you. Here we go. That's smaller than usual. Sorry, can you see that?
Okay, I can enlarge it. Yep. Right. Joseph's imprisonment finally ends when Pharaoh dreams of 7 fat cows that are swallowed up by 7 lean cows, and of 7 fat ears of cooked grain swallowed by 7 lean ears. Joseph interprets the dreams to mean that 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of hunger, and advises Pharaoh to store grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh appoints Joseph governor of Egypt. Joseph marries Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, and they have 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Famine spreads throughout the region, and food can be obtained only in Egypt. 10 of Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to purchase grain. The youngest, Benjamin, stays home, for Jacob fears for his safety. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. He accuses them of being spies, insists that they bring Benjamin to prove that they are who they say they are, and imprisons Simeon as a hostage. Later, they discover that the money they paid for their provisions has been mysteriously returned to them. Jacob agrees to send Benjamin only after Judah assumes personal and eternal responsibility for him. This time, Joseph receives them kindly, releases Simeon, and invites them to an eventful dinner at his home. But then he plants his silver goblet, purportedly imbued with magic powers, in Benjamin's sack. When the brothers set out for home the next morning, they are pursued, searched, and arrested when the goblet is discovered. Joseph offers to set them free and retain only Benjamin as his slave.
Thank you very much.
Rabbi, it says that Joseph marries Asenath, daughter of Potiphar.
Yes.
I thought it was Potipharah, the priest of On, not Potiphar, the captain of the guard that he had been slave to.
No, it was the same one. You got to wonder why he did that, right? So they say that Potiphar's wife foresaw that Joseph was going to end up with basically as part of the family. The only thing is she got the wrong generation.
But I thought that in the text, I thought it calls the one who Joseph was slave to Potiphar, captain of the guard, and the one was his father-in-law, Potipharah,
As far as
priest of On.
I recall, they're both referred to as Potipharah. It's the same person. That's the
Oh.
whole story that
So he was captain of the guard and a priest at the same time.
pass, not sure.
Rabbi, the magic powers that the goblet is supposed to be imbued with, do we know what they're supposed to be?
No, I'm not familiar with that explanation at all, actually.
No, me neither.
Never heard of that before.
No.
I'd heard of that, yes.
Where have you heard of that?
I don't know, but I have heard of it.
One
And I
second,
don't know any more than the fact that I've heard of it.
I'll ask my better half. What magic powers is the goblet?
We've got to contact the chief rabbi's office.
Who?
Do a bit of tidying up, paper bits.
What's he gone
Name a
to?
Gone
vague
quiet.
something about some kind of prophecy. Okay, we'll have to do some research on that and also on Potiphar's identity. But today we're going to look at Joseph's role as Prime Minister of Egypt.
Rabbi, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've just been looking up in the text, and the and the Sonsino Humash gives the commentary. It says that the Potiphar that was his father-in-law, it says Aseneth, the wife was meant belonging to the goddess Neith, and Potipharah to be distinguished from Potiphar, the former master of Joseph. And he was the priest of On, later known as Heliopolis, the center of the sun worship in Egypt.
That's interesting, because I always understood the whole point of Mrs. Potiphar trying to seduce Joseph was that she had a vision that they were going to have offspring together, and the mistake she made was that it was her daughter and not her.
Well, as I say, this is why I knew about why I was saying about this, because in the Chumash, the commentary says that it was to be distinguished from Potiphar, the former master.
Right.
He was Potipharah, priest of On.
I wonder if everyone agrees with that. That's interesting. Okay, it's perfectly possible.
I don't know what any other Chumash might.
You do have to ask. Whoops, sorry. You do have to ask yourself why I would have wanted to mix it into that particular family again after the Taurus. Okay, so
The daughter is that right? Isn't she adopted? Am I wrong on that?
Who?
I honestly don't remember.
Because I understood it that she was actually Dina's daughter.
I have heard that.
Yeah.
1 second.
What you mean, Asenath, who Joseph's wife?
Osnath.
Well, the text says, unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came, whom Aseneth, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore unto him.
That she was the
Pharaoh
daughter of.
called Joseph's name Saphenath Paneah and gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. Doesn't.
Yeah, there are views that say that she was Dina's daughter that from the rape that was abandoned and was raised by Potiphar and his wife. Yes.
Okay.
There is,
Can we get on with it, because we've only got a little time.
Yeah, let's carry on. Okay, lots to discuss. Please go away and feel free to look into that further. Plenty of good resources available. Chabad.org, h.com, ou.org. Anyway, right. So we're actually going to look at Joseph and his his power, if you like, his role. Last week, Cedra, and sort of until now, he's had a very unfortunate life, right? He's been a prisoner. He's been a kind of had one misfortune after another. He's not really had control of his destiny. It's his father, then his brothers, then the Midianites, then the Ishmaelites, then Potiphar and his wife, then the prison warden, basically all running his life. The most important thing he seems to have had any control over is his dreams, which are just dreams at the end of the day that happen to you. They're not something you choose. So he's not had too many choices in life, Joseph. If you look at his life until now, he's had very little choice or control of his life. How does last week's Cedra end? Here we go. Who wants to read number 1?
I'll do it then. I'll do that.
Go. Nice, short and sweet.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Yet the chief cupbearer did not think of Joseph. He forgot him.
Right. Joseph says to him, I ask you one thing. When you go back to Pharaoh, please just remember me. Right. And he forgot him for 2 years. So even when things seem to be falling into place at the end of last week's Cedra, it's not a smooth path. So even his attempt to change his destiny doesn't initially succeed. And then suddenly it all changes. What happens in this week's Cedra? Right? After 2 years, Pharaoh's having dreams. The butler says, oh, I remember this chap who I was in prison with. And suddenly everything, before you know it, by the end of the Cedra, Joseph's all powerful. Right? He's got an economic plan. He doesn't just interpret the dreams. Right? He comes up with a whole plan for the economy for the next 14 years. He comes up with a solution, solves the problem, and basically gets appointed. And it all happens very, very quickly. Such a difference between this poor slave chap who's just kind of, everyone else is directing his life, and suddenly he takes control. Here's what Margaret Thatcher said about Lord Young. Here we go. Nice Jewish boy. Who wants to read number 2?
I'll do it then. Would you want to do it?
Yes. Other people bring me problems. David brings me solutions.
I don't know if that's the original use of that phrase, but I've heard that phrase many times. No problems, just solutions or something like that in various forms. But Joseph doesn't bring Pharaoh problems. He brings him solutions to problems, right? And this is what happens in the Cedra. When Joseph says to Pharaoh, here's the interpretation of your dream. This is what it means. And what you have to do is you have to stockpile grain for 7 years. It always amuses me that, when they talk about the austerity years, right? And the boom and bust and whatever. And I mean, now it seems like a joke because the chancellor has a money tree. But in the old days when they had to control spending, you always wondered why in the boom years they didn't put money away for the years of austerity, and they never did. Had they not read the Bible, right? Instead of spend, they should have saved money for a rainy day. Biblical stuff. That's Joseph's plan. It's not rocket science. His plan is that during the boom years, you put money away for the years of austerity. And what happens when he comes up with this plan? Everyone's very happy afterwards, right? And you have this rather bizarre thing where Pharaoh says, that's a great idea. Where could we find someone to implement such an idea? Well, he's standing right here. Yeah. Who wants to read number 3? This is Pharaoh's reaction to his plan. Yeah.
The plan pleased Pharaoh and all his courtiers. And Pharaoh said to his courtiers, could we find another like him, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?
Right. So anyone know how old Joseph was at the time?
37.
He was 30, I think.
Okay.
Isaac was 37 at the Akedah. He was 30, it seems. He suddenly becomes the most powerful man around. He goes from being a prisoner in the space of one Cedra. Now, to be fair, a Cedra can be a long time. Last week's Cedra covered the events of Yehuda and Tamar, which would be probably 30 or 40 years or something like that. But anyway, in the space of a very seemingly short time, he goes from being this Nebuch who's, been sold into slavery to suddenly becoming the most powerful man in Egypt besides Pharaoh. He travels around, he collects grain, arranges its storage. The Torah says that there's so much grain that they stop keeping track of it. And of course, when they hit the years of famine, he becomes even more powerful. Everyone turns to him, even Pharaoh himself. What does Pharaoh say to everyone that comes to him? Here we go. When they're feeling the famine, number 4. Who wants to read? I can't see anyone. So
I'll read.
Go on.
Do you want me to? Who?
I'll read, shall I?
Go for it.
And when all the land of Egypt felt the hunger, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he tells you, you shall do."
Right. Anyone know what happens next? Which is actually quite disturbing
Makes them
in the
sound.
story.
Don't they sell the grain to the farmers, and gradually, as the farmers and the people, they end up selling all their land to Pharaoh or to Joseph for the grain, and end up so that all the land of Egypt belongs to Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And then they sell themselves into slavery to get food.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Wouldn't that be grounds for anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
Resentment.
Absolutely, yes.
The Jews run all the banks.
Yes.
Also, at the beginning of the book of Shmos, when Pharaoh suddenly turns on them, he has a lot of power. Who set up all that power for him?
Pharaoh.
Joseph.
Joseph.
Let's have a look. Oh, so yes, chapter 47, which comes in a minute. They use up all their money buying grain. They come to Joseph asking for food, telling him that, we'll die. And he says, fine, so sell your livestock, right? Which is obviously also their livelihood, which they do. And then they sell their land. And eventually, basically, they end up selling themselves. So Pharaoh ends up with livestock, private land, and by the way, something really interesting, which I never noticed before. Have a look at this one. This is from chapter 47. Pam, would you like to read that?
Yeah. And he removed the population town by town from one end of Egypt's borders to the other.
Enforced resettlement, which of course has been used against us over the years. So in another time, another place, he'd be a complete megalomaniac. He's got everyone basically enslaving themselves, their livestock, their source of income, their family land, everything to the state. He's moving people around and basically controlling population. It's pretty heavy stuff. Pharaoh never asked him to do it. Seems he did it of his own accord. What was the end result? That the state, or Pharaoh in this case, ends up with unprecedented power, which is later used against us, and unprecedented wealth. We find a very familiar phrase. Have a look. 2 places. Who would like to read number 6?
I can do that.
So this is the dialogue that's going on about their need to basically get grain. Yes, off you go, Julia.
Let us not perish before your eyes, both we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread, and we with our land will be serfs to Pharaoh. Provide the seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste. And they said, you have saved our lives. We are grateful to my Lord, and we shall be serfs to Pharaoh.
And the Hebrew is avadim lepharaoh. We will be servants to Pharaoh, slaves to Pharaoh. They seemed happy about it.
Well, they didn't want to die. They were hungry, and look what Esau did for a little drop of food.
Lentils. Yeah. Let's have a look. Let's see the whole summary there. Who wants to read number 7?
I'll read again.
Yeah.
Let us not perish before your eyes, both we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread. And we with our land will be serfs to Pharaoh. Provide the seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste. So Joseph gained possession of all the farmland of Egypt for Pharaoh, every Egyptian having sold his field because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh.
Ethical behavior?
No.
No.
So I don't know what the view would be on this generally, but I know certainly in halacha, you're not allowed to profiteer. When you hear stories like, there's a heat wave and suddenly bottled water doubles in price or something, a commodity, you're not allowed to do that. You're absolutely not allowed to racketeer from things.
But he wasn't doing it for himself. He was doing it on behalf of Pharaoh.
Of the state. So what's the usual explanation we give for us becoming slaves in Egypt? We say it was a punishment for the brothers enslaving Joseph, and that may well be true on a spiritual level. But if you look at all the groundwork being done, who's the first person that brings the concept of slavery, of being slaves to Pharaoh, to Egypt? It's Joseph.
Joseph.
Right?
But also the people were willing. Let's not forget they were willing to become their slaves.
They were desperate.
No
They
choice.
didn't have much other choice, did they?
No, they were hungry.
Yes.
As you said, Asaph is proof desperate people do desperate things.
Yes.
But it's interesting that you don't have to read the story that closely to see that all the building blocks in place are actually put there by Joseph.
Yeah.
I don't know how much Pharaoh was involved in day-to-day running the country. He leaves it to his to Joseph.
He didn't want a headache, did he?
Well,
Rabbi, can I ask
Yeah.
a question? Was it only Egypt which is in famine?
no, there's famine everywhere, but the Egyptians were the only ones that had the food. So people came to Egypt for food. That's how the brothers came.
No, I mean in the whole world.
Well, in the area.
Certainly
No.
in the area. Oh, good question. I don't know. Certainly in Canaan, because they came to Egypt.
No, because I was just wondering why they didn't, why the people didn't leave Egypt for a better
But
land.
how would they have known? I mean, it's pretty amazing that Jacob heard there was food in Egypt. I don't know how people heard things. I mean, there's another issue here also, which is that we always hear about how Joseph comes to Pharaoh with this wonderful solution that you're going to save all the food. In reality, it's a bit like communism here. A great solution, but from what's on the screen there and the previous, it doesn't seem like the people of Egypt particularly benefited from this. Okay, you could say they benefited because at least there was food available in Egypt. It's very expensive, but it was available. Other places didn't even have food. But the Egyptian people were taken advantage of by their leadership, one of whom was Pharaoh and the other was the Jew Joseph. It's not very wholesome stuff. Right?
No, but Hashem sent the dream. So it must have been some plan from Hashem, though.
Of course, it's all Hashem's plan, and we see ultimately the reason for it. But in short-term terms, you've got Joseph who turns the Egyptians into a nation of slaves and creates the power base for Pharaoh.
Yes, absolutely. He wasn't such a pretty boy then, was he? He was had a brain on him.
Should make you uneasy, really.
Yeah.
Now, at the end of the day, we don't know. He was loyal to Pharaoh. He was doing what was ultimately good for Egypt in the long term. Remember, as a child, he dreamt of power. As an adult, he had power. Right? Judaism, interestingly, from Pirkei Avot, it says hate power, run away from power, because power corrupts.
Yeah.
Joseph's policies, you can't criticize them on a sort of generational level. They worked for that time, but on a more moral kind of long-term view, they're very disturbing.
Yeah.
But he brought his children up to be Jewish, didn't he?
Yes. Let me ask you a question. Is this the first case of somebody Jewish, whatever Jewish meant before the Exodus, somebody from our patriarchal families who has a political role? Who else has that role? Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov weren't political. Okay, you've got somebody with a political role. It shows the problem with power. On the one hand, you need someone to have power in society.
But actually, Abraham and Isaac, Jacob did have political power, but only within their own tribe,
right?
not
So,
over
right,
the
but
land
they didn't
itself.
have governmental influence.
No,
He's
but
got
only they did in their own tribe, but only in their own
Yes.
tribe.
He's got someone who's got governmental influence in the whole of Egypt. He's
Over
got a full position.
others, yeah.
And the ambiguity is clear. You have to have power. On the other hand, power is easily abused.
Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Joseph may well have thought he was doing the right thing by being loyal to Pharaoh and by strengthening his hand. And of course, he may not have known that this was going to happen. Who wants to read source number 8?
I'll do
Pardon?
it. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph.
Right at the beginning of the book of Shemos. Who remembers the explanation of this? There's 2 explanations about how he didn't know him.
Because he didn't want to know him.
Right. So one is that he kind of like covered his eyes, you know, hear no evil, see no evil, and he conveniently forgot about all the good that Joseph did for him. The other is it was actually a new Pharaoh. And often, you know, when you have regime change, people don't always keep people from the old regime. So it's ironic, you know, with hindsight, which of course is the perfect science, but the more power you give to Pharaoh, the more you're endangering your people, because he can now abuse it. So we have this kind of little problem going on here. You can't fault Joseph for his actions in at least the short term. He did what he had to do, and he was highly influential, and he saved Egyptian society. And in the process, he obviously was also a way that he reunited his family, which was obviously the destiny of the Jewish people. But if you look at his political career, it's checkered. He's the one that enabled Pharaoh to become the despot he became, if you look at it that way.
Nizet Benegid Mida. Do you think it's that we're getting it back? What happens to them? They gave it to us back.
You could say that. It's pretty ironic, isn't it? The Egyptians were enslaved because of Joseph's policies, and then we were enslaved by the Egyptians. That's no one ever puts it in those terms. You know how they always say, you know, that it's always the Israelis that strike first, and the Palestinians retaliate. You know, so here it's like we started it by our guy managed to get the Egyptians into poverty. It's a question. So anyone knows when Joseph died?
Oh, he was the first of the brothers to die.
Yeah, why? He was the righteous one.
Was he?
Was he the righteous one?
Let's see what the Talmud says. Number 9. Who would like to read?
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
He was the first.
Who?
Go on, Pam, you want to read?
Okay, yeah. And with regard to one who conducts himself with an air of superiority, as Rabbi Hamaset, son of Rabbi Hanina, said, why did Joseph die before his brothers, as evidenced by the order in the verse? And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. Because he conducted himself with an air of superiority, and those who did not serve in a leadership role lived on after he died.
Right? Interesting.
Very.
Now, to be fair, who wants leadership? Who wants power? You know, it's corrupting. But he doesn't get a totally clean slate. Although he's called Yosef HaTzadik, the righteous one. See, there's criticism of it. Here it's criticism he had an air of superiority. You may recall that the commentaries say that when he was a boy, he was always preening himself in the mirror. He was very vain. You know, the whole story, for the story to work in the way that it does, you know, for him to rise so quickly in Egypt, for him to get, you know, catch the eye of Potiphar and the prison guard and all these people, he wouldn't have been a shrinking violet. He was clearly an outgoing, vivacious person, right? He wore a multicolored coat after all, right? Which is not a crime, but he clearly wasn't a shrinking violet. He was clearly okay with this, you know, self-aggrandizement. Otherwise, he couldn't have played that part. And that's one of the problems with politics. It's very hard to be in politics and not, you know, enjoy the trappings of power. That's probably why Judaism is historically frowned upon, Jews going into politics, because it's very hard to be moral and upright and not get caught up in trappings of power. We know that even for a king, it says he shouldn't have too many wives or too many horses, because he'll become arrogant. Many kings did. Many kings failed. So it's interesting that some of the commentaries seem to discuss Yosef's policies, and there's a disagreement. Some people say, look, it's easy to be in America they call it a Monday morning quarterback, right? It's the guy that tells you how you should have played the football game afterwards. So it's very easy to do that. At the end of the day, he did what he had to do, and what he did was very good for his country, ultimately for the state, and probably at the time for the Jewish people. Right? They enjoyed great respect, but also it set the seeds for some of the things that went wrong. Paro wouldn't have had all that power, perhaps. They wouldn't have the model of slavery, ironically, if people hadn't got into that situation. And the amazing thing is, as far as I know, in the book of Shmos, when it starts talking about Pharaoh whipping everyone up against the Jews, the one thing he doesn't say, which he could well have said, is thanks to this Jewish boy, you all lost your homes and you all lost your livestock. He doesn't even get into that, which is so ironic, because that would have been a legitimate claim. But it's playing a very dangerous game. On the other hand, that's, I suppose, the risk of politics. When you get into politics, is to be humble somehow.
Well, when did the Egyptians stop being slaves to Pharaoh? Because when the Jews were slaves, they all seemed to have a good life, the Egyptians.
It's a good question. I guess at some point they all paid off their debt. Presumably the austerity measures must have ended. I remember
that. Wasn't it that the rule was that they carried on living on their own lands,
so they gave Pharaoh a tithe.
They farmed their lands and gave part of their crops and that to Pharaoh.
Yeah, so it seems like they paid. You're right. They paid off. Remember, at the beginning of Shmos, when it talks about Joseph dying there, that's generation change. It's a generation later that the trouble starts. So presumed by then they'd started paying off their debts, and they weren't quite so enslaved to Pharaoh. I don't know all the detail, but you don't notice this. I'm not sure I paid attention to this before. I mean, the population movement, that's fascinating. That's the sort of thing nowadays that you get UN resolutions about if populations are forced to move by certain, for economic reasons. That's shocking. Resettling people. It's all shocking stuff. A lot of it is, there's nothing new under the sun. A lot of the things that take place in contemporary society took place in ancient society. Population oppression and movement, and people hyperinflation, people not being able to afford anything. As I said in Shul, the pursuit of Yosef by Potiphar's wife also, it could be a modern day story of harassment. Only it's a powerful woman. Interesting, by the way. But then that takes place before in last week's Sedra, he's this Nebuch. Yes, he shines. Everyone realizes he's got, the golden touch, but he really doesn't do very well until this week's Sedra. Last week's Sedra, he has a miserable existence. Everything goes wrong with him.
Yeah, it seems that the Egyptians didn't become slaves in the way that we always sort of think of people as being slaves. It says, and Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I brought you this day, and I bought you this day and your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And shall come to pass at the ingathering, you shall give a fifth unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own for seed of the field and for your food." And they said, "Thou saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's bondsmen." But they weren't actually being taken into actual
It's not the hard labor. You're right. It's not the hard labor the Israelites had. And maybe that also explains another question, which is how come the Israelites in the beginning didn't realize what was going on? Maybe that's the answer, because maybe that was normal behavior for Egypt. Maybe Egypt was essentially a communist country where the leadership had everything, and the proletariat were used to living like that. Yeah. So when Pharaoh told the Jews, "You're going to have to live like that and work hard and pay heavy taxes," initially they just thought that was life. They never knew anything different. That would make a lot of sense, actually.
Do you think?
You're right. It's not the kind of slavery. Slavery in the Torah is often talking about a person who had to basically sell themselves into service to pay a debt. So that's not quite the same as the slavery of the Egyptians, where they were, forcing them to work long hours and physical misery and so on. Correct. It's saying you're going to wash the dishes to pay for your meal. It's controlled, if you like.
On the other hand, don't you think that he did all that in order to make it so difficult for his father and brothers that they had to come to him? Because if nobody had anything, they couldn't get anything from anybody, but they had to go to Egypt, and that's what he wanted.
Correct. It was all an elaborate. We have discussed this before.
Okay.
But why couldn't he just have a conversation with his brothers and say, do you regret it? And they had to feel it themselves. So of course, really, the backdrop to all of this is really only happening for the story of Joseph and his brothers to take place. The whole world has to suffer. We find this with the plagues, right? It's quite an unsavory thought that God says, I will bring these plagues upon Egypt to show the Israelites my might and power.
Right. Yeah.
So the Egyptians have to suffer in order the Israelites should see how powerful God is. Right? The whole world has to. I don't know if this is going on with coronavirus. There's some deep reason for it which we don't know yet. But the whole world at the time has to go through this famine just so that this, Shmerel and his brothers who couldn't get along can reunite. Couldn't you find an easy way of doing it? Couldn't they just communicate better with each other? But that's the nature of Hashgacha Pratis, is that all kinds of things can happen to allow one event to take place. We do know, of course, that Yosef had to see the brothers were sincerely done to Shuvah. And I guess you don't really know that until you're really put in that position. But look at the story. It's pretty, it's heavy stuff. And you definitely get a sense that maybe the power corrupted him a little bit, that he was getting drunk on the power. The slave boy suddenly vice chancellor of Egypt and quite enjoying it by the sound of it. He has no problem saying to Pharaoh, there's none more powerful than in Egypt. No, to Potiphar's wife, there's no more powerful in Egypt than me, except for Pharaoh, says there's none more powerful in the master's house except for me. Except, he's quite, I can't remember the exact phrase, he's quite happy to boast about it. And to be fair, you have to have that personality to go into politics. You can't be a shrinking violet, it won't work. I don't remember who, but there was somebody that ran against Nixon in the 70s who was a Jewish trade unionist who, by all accounts, was a very decent, hardworking man. There's a rabbi in Aish called Moti Berger. He said that he once asked his father why his father said he voted for Nixon, why he voted for Nixon and not for this kind of, very decent, I can't remember his name, but decent, sort of homely, wholesome, honest, down-to-earth, hard-working Jewish boy. And his father said, because when the Russians are going to push the nuclear button, I don't want someone reasonable in the White House. I want someone who thinks like that. You could say the same thing about Trump, Bissell Meshuggah. But actually, he didn't start a war with North Korea. He probably is the person that understood them the most because he's got similar characteristics.
Was it
what was Chamberlain's problem? Chamberlain comes back from Germany and says, peace in our time. Why? Because Chamberlain thinks to himself, I'm a reasonable person. Hitler must also be a reasonable person.
He judged people by their own standards.
We project onto others, right? It's one of the biggest challenges in all these things. I think it's something the Israelis often suffer from as well. The Israelis say to themselves, well, we're decent people. All we want is peace. We'd be very happy with a good life and, lots of investment and so on. So the Palestinians should be happy with the same thing. But you're assuming that everyone thinks the way you do. That's not the reality. One of the biggest challenges is getting someone else's head. It's very hard. But Joseph clearly was able to enjoy the trappings of power to an extent. Anyway, I'm not here to criticize Joseph. He was a righteous man who lived through very difficult times. And of course, interestingly, as mentioned, he raised his children as Jewish. And not only that, he raised them without any brotherly strife. Right? And there are two reasons that we bless our children. We bless our girls in the name of the matriarchs, but we don't bless our boys in the name of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Or Yosef, we bless them in the name of Ephraim and Manasseh. Right? There are two reasons. One is because they got on as brothers, even when one of them got the bracha before the other. Right? As you recall, next week, etc. Number one, or the week after. And number two, because they were the first people to grow up in exile and still have a Jewish identity. It's really interesting. So homework is to go look up whether there were 2 pontiffers or 1. What was the other thing? Oh, well, what? How long they were actually kind of enslaved to Pharaoh? I mean, it can't have gone on forever. They must have paid their debts eventually. The more I think about it, it's not that far off from the way communism was, right?
They didn't really have a debt to Pharaoh. They actually sold their land and their cattle, and that they sold them to Joseph for
But it says
food.
that
They
says that
they
when-
didn't borrow from Joseph. They sold.
No, but it says
But
that
where
after
was the
that, when
debt?
they had nothing left to sell, they said they would work to pay it off, basically. It does sound highly communistic. Now, who wants to live in a society where they basically put up the price of grain and bleed you dry? Doesn't seem like it was. Remember also, their Egyptian society, we're talking here about Egyptian society. The time of the Exodus, we're told that Egyptian society was the most, base and immoral society around. So, doesn't have the best reputation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, I think we'll probably pause there. Barry Goldwater, sounds familiar. Thank you. Yes. No, Pam just put on the chat, Barry Goldwater. That sounds right. Yeah.
Oh, is the man
He
in
was
America?
But I do seriously think, by the way, that's probably why Trump was able to
American president.
get all these deals with these Arab countries, because he thinks like a Meshuggah. He thinks like a megalomaniac, like a dictator, and therefore they probably relate to him better. Sometimes you need someone like that.
He didn't die.
Strange world. What can
He
you do?
died for him because he was
Mm.
not because he was Jewish, but
So when's
Right.
Mashiach
something
coming then?
stronger in.
Sorry?
So when's Mashiach coming in this strange world?
Well, contrary to what a lot of the Jewish community thinks, Mr. Trump clearly was not Mashiach. They loved him in America. In America, they were obsessed with him. The religious community was obsessed with him. Yes, he was pro-Israel. Yes, he was really amazing on many things. He wasn't a particularly moral or, good example of humanity. He just happened to be good for the Jew. So we shall see. I'm going to go and have a hot drink with some honey in. Anyway, thank
Good
you. for joining.
idea.
And don't forget to buy vitamin D. You can get it at the
Sorry?
chemist, and it's very, very cheap.
I will try it. Thank you. I think I've got some somewhere, actually. I'll have a look.
Wish you better.
Take it regularly.
Yeah,
Wish
wish
you
you better, Rabbi. Wish you better.
Very well. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, thank you, and wish your throat better.
Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there.